logic games, for those who aren't aware, this is the shortest section of the exam, by the way, only 22 to 24 questions. It's the most perfectible section of the exam because it's really the most mathematical. I've laid out some details about it here. One thing I want to call your attention to, though, is that the average of 8 minutes and 45 seconds per game, that is simply an average. I find far too many students have difficulty actually keeping themselves to that strict time constraint, when in reality, you don't need to. Not all games are of equal difficulty. Some games, ideally, should be only 5 to 6 minutes long, meaning you should get it done in 5 to 6 minutes. I know it might sound crazy, but it actually is possible. Some games, like the famous CDs game featured in Legally Blonde with the used and new CDs in the different genres, that game, 12 minutes, I would think is totally reasonable on seeing it for the first time. The key is to drill these games, to drill them by type, and then to drill yourself even just in terms of full-length timed sections. And I agree with some of the comments in the chat. I think this is the most fun section. For me, I hated it at first because I was not a mathematical person. That's just not how my brain works. I was much more of a verbal person, so the logical reasoning and reading comp were better for me. But over time, I actually came to love the games because I saw the patterns in terms of how different games relate to each other. And so in a moment, we'll talk about ordering versus grouping. You'll see some of those common patterns there. So next slide, Joel. Thanks. So game types. I think game types are overemphasized, which is why I'm keeping it fairly simple as I can here. Sequencing, grouping, combinations. Some people will say ordering, others will say sequencing, same idea. You're putting things in chronological order or you're ranking them. But idea is you're putting them in some kind of order, so there's a before-after aspect to it. If it's solely relational, I would say it's more relative. But if it's relating variables to specific slots on a diagram, so for example, if you have 7 variables, you're placing in order 1 through 7, and they say that like A is on slot 3, B is on slot 5, that would be more strict versus A is before B. That's a bit more loose, a bit more relative. Then grouping, I've laid out, you've got where you're choosing some, not others, AKA in, out, or selection, or if you're dividing them, or if you're just broadly associating variables of one type with variables of another type, but you're not putting anything in order. You could stop there and get a good sense of what games are about. Then you've got combination games where they're really mixing it up. You might be choosing some variables, not others. Then the ones that you choose, you're putting them in a list or in a row, in a rank or an order of some kind. That gets a bit more complicated. And then, of course, you've also got what I call curveball or weird logic games, where they're not even really related to each other. They're just different in some way. And many recent exams, those in the prep tests numbered in the 70s and the 80s, you've got plenty of those. I've got a list of them on my website. If you just search weird curveball LSAT logic games on my blog, you'll find it. And I've listed every logic game from 1 to 80 that has something weird going on about it. And so once you've mastered the sequencing, the grouping, the combinations, and you really want to perfect games, which I recommend, I would say work on the curveballs. And games in general, again, most perfectible. The typical 170 score is getting perfect on games, maybe -1, and then -3 or so on each of the other sections. Can you get a 170 plus getting several wrong on games? Maybe, but it's really tough to perfect reasoning and reading comp because they have those ambiguities of language that games doesn't have. And so it's mathematical. It can be formulaic in certain contexts. And when you get that formula, when you see the relationships, it really does unlock itself. And you'll kind of just know what to do through your subconscious in a way, through your intuition, through having done so many games up to that point. Now, these questions are bite-sized. They're not related to each other typically. So you have 25, 26 questions typically, and question 3 does not relate to question 4. So that's good and bad. If you didn't like question 3, well, you can move on and just go into question 4 and start fresh. Alternatively, with games and reading comp, you're really investing yourself a lot up front. And if you are, then in that case, that could pay off well if you really got what the game or the passage was about. But but if you didn't really get what the game or passage was about, then you've got a problem. Logical reasoning doesn't have that. Logical reasoning does have the clearest general order of difficulty, though, because they're bite-sized. And so question 20 will typically be much harder than question number 5, but maybe 18 is actually harder than 20. But within games, game 1 might be easier than game 4, but the questions within a game are not really difficulty ranked in quite the same way. Again, average amount of time, approximately 130. In reality, maybe more like 125 or 123, meaning a minute and 25 seconds. Again, I wouldn't time them strictly, though. I would never time individual logical reasoning questions because, again, some are harder than others. So maybe question 20 will take you 2.5 minutes, and that's fine. Maybe some will even take you 3 minutes. But again, that's okay because you might have gotten one of the easier questions in the first 10 or so in maybe 30 seconds or even 25 seconds, believe it or not, if you just get it through intuition, because the method of reasoning really is that simple. I get questions about pacing a lot. I have a question about pacing submitted in advance, and really, how do you deal with the order of difficulty? I would say if you're aiming for 165 plus or 160 plus reasonably, I would aim to do the first 10 questions in approximately 10, 12 minutes, which is a fast pace, less than 125 or 130, but that builds up a time bank to allow you to solve the tougher questions later in the section and devote more time to them. And you can move on to the next one, Joel. So 2 types of logical reasoning questions. You have some where the stimulus is assumed to be true and the answer choices are under suspicion. So that would be like inference questions. Must be true, most strongly supported, main point. You're not really challenging the stimulus or challenging any sort of perceived gap there, if there is a gap, if it is an argument. Then in the second category there, where the answer choices are assumed true and the stimulus is under suspicion, that's more like strengthen, weaken, evaluate the argument, resolve the paradox. They're asking you which one of the following, if true, would do X to the argument, strengthen it or weaken it. And it's really important to view the question from that proper perspective, which is why drilling the A for accuracy in that laser approach to LSAT prep I mentioned earlier, that's why drilling is so important, because it helps you know which of these 2 that you're dealing with. You go to the next one. So again, that first category, stimulus assumed true, I would fit these question types, necessary assumption, flaw, parallels, pointed issue, and so on, into that first category. You'll notice a lot of these involve articulating something about the stimulus, like flaw questions, method of reasoning, role of the statement. You're not actually doing anything to the argument. All you're doing in these cases is really just describing what's going on. Same for those bottom inference types. You're describing what's happening. You're not actually attacking the argument or strengthening it or doing anything to it. You're simply describing what's going on. Next one, Joel. Thanks. Yeah, so this is a different category where we are doing something to the argument. So strengthen, weaken, we are, of course, closing that gap or further exposing that gap in those cases. So it's really important to say to yourself, no matter how extreme the choices seem, doesn't matter, we're taking them as true and seeing what consequence they would have if true. Okay, so again, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this, but again, feel free to, of course, screenshot these. I'm describing what you need to be doing in those cases. So in those cases, you're addressing the answer choice in a particular way to make sure that you're articulating what needs to be articulated. Next one. Next. And so this one, again, describing what your job is. It's really important to know your job. If you don't know your job, if you don't know the task at hand, you're not going to be able to solve the question appropriately. Too many times students read the stimulus, they're like, I don't really know what this says. Let me go to the choices and see if that helps. Going to the choices is not going to help because the choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus and in the context of the question type. So if you don't know what method of reasoning is, you're not going to get method of reasoning questions right. And reading the choices will only further complicate what you're doing because they're giving you more information that you can't place in the appropriate bucket. So students, again, they too often, like I did, jump into full-length timed exams or individual timed sections without doing the hard work of learning. You're basically getting the theory and concepts down, and then A for accuracy, drilling questions by type. I know it's really tempting to see what your section result is or what your full-length exam result is, but again, you've got to do the work first in order to get those results. If you're doing diagnostics, your diagnosis is not going to be very good unless you do the hard work first to build your understanding from the beginning before getting into the timed work, in which case you'll really see your scores rise. Next one. Thank you. Okay, so again, more describing your job for these question types. I don't need to go into the details. Screenshot it if you like. Next one. Thanks. Again, next, so again, more on resolve the paradox. Your job is, I know that we're a bit behind on time here, so I don't want to belabor all of this, but some of the links I put in the chat, we'll get into this as well. So approach, logical reasoning approach. Joel, could you go back one moment just so that somebody can screenshot that? One more, she's saying one more. All right, sufficient assumptions. So yeah, you're looking to close the gap 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all, which means it doesn't matter how extreme the choice is for this category. Doesn't matter as long as it gets the job done. So reading comp has not changed since June 07. You've got now 3 long passages, 2 short dual or comparative passages. Again, you have that average of 845 per passage, like you have 845 per game. That is simply an average though. Some are easier, some are harder. I worked through the riddled basins of attraction passage with somebody recently. I think that's from Prep Test 50. Super tough passage, 12, 13 minutes, no question about it. Same goes for this passage on the Big Bang Theory and the creation of the universe and the multiverse. Super hard passage, again, 12, 13 minutes, not simply 845. The idea is some are easier, some are harder. Don't time yourself on individual passages. And again, the order of difficulty is really hard to say. Passage 1's probably easier than passages 3 and 4, but other than that, I wouldn't obsess too much over it. But for a top score for 160, 165 plus, I would typically recommend attempting all 4 passages, just like I would all 4 games. Topics: humanities, science, social science, law and politics. You could go ahead, it's fine. Yeah, so humanities, you've got some, next slide, if you don't mind. So you've got, I've broken down some typical or common topics for these passage categories. You're going to have one on each of humanities, law, natural science, and social science. At least one of those 4 will also be on minorities or women. And so just be aware of that going in. And humanities, objectivism versus subjectivism is, I think, one of the most repeated passages, topics on the LSAT. It'll take a variety of different forms, but I've seen this come up again and again and again. So if you're not comfortable with those concepts, look them up. Go on Wikipedia. If you encounter a passage that gives you trouble, and if you get a general sense of what it was about, look it up, get comfortable with it, because it very well could come up again. I actually have a list of reading comp passages, topics that repeated multiple times. This first one, objectivism and subjectivism in general, has come up several different times. Get a good sense of what that's about if you don't like it, because it could very well repeat. So prior knowledge could help, it could hurt. But either way, I would suggest you not go beyond the passage in terms of content, but you can still use your general knowledge from the past to help you better understand what you're reading and to better bucket it. You could go on, Joel. Thanks. Okay. So yeah, so it's just I'm just listing some other common topics. You'll notice I mentioned dinosaur extinction there in the natural science category. Of course, you see several logical reasoning questions on that as well. So make sure you're comfortable with your dinosaur extinction. And again, the reason these topics come up in both LR and reading comp is really because they're not meant to generate an emotional response. So for example, I mentioned passages on minorities and women on the reading comp. Is it going to be about Black Lives Matter or current events? Definitely not. They're going to talk about a scholar of some kind, and they're not going to be totally negative or totally positive. The tone will typically be something like qualified approval or modified or moderate skepticism. Yes, being a humanities major can definitely help. And obviously law passages, some folks don't like the law passages. I get it, because they're more academic in nature, but try to get interested in these, because after all, you do want to go to law school. And I get why you wouldn't like natural science, but again, it's not really about the topic. It's much more about your evaluation of the way they go about presenting the information. And they're somewhat dispassionate about it. They're not looking to generate strong emotional responses, but do what you can to caricature or exaggerate a little bit about it, just to get a little bit more excited. I have one student who would always say like, hell yeah, when she's reading as she goes through these, to just try and like, oh, for real? Like to just try and get a sense of like she's having a conversation with somebody. Michonne, for those in my courses who know her. Yeah, so this is just some more common topics that have come up in the past. Yeah, so again, just if any of these you don't like, they've all appeared, so get comfortable with them. I talk about outside knowledge a little bit. It can help, it can hurt, but don't actually use it to help you solve the questions, but use it to help yourself get a general framework about what's going on. You don't need it, but obviously it could help a little bit. Reading for structure. That's the biggest thing I would think about here. Read for structure. Don't read for the details. On the digital LSAT and the Flex, you do have highlighting and underlining tools. They're not the most precise. They're not the most useful. I wouldn't rely on them. I would certainly test them out beforehand to make sure you're comfortable with how they function and their limitations. I find the most reliable thing is to make markings, minimal ones, on your scratch paper to the side and stick with that. As for scratch, you get five sheets of paper for the Flex, which is 10 pages double-sided. On the digital, who knows if and when that'll come back, you get a booklet of 12 to 14 pages. And they don't specify the size of the paper. So those who are legally minded might want to try using legal sized paper, 8.5 by 14 rather than 8.5 by 11, up to the proctor's discretion, but people have successfully used it. And as Hannah is mentioning in the chat, you can use Control F on the Flex. Control F is permitted, which can really help you to quickly find keywords back in the passage. And you can move on to the next one, Joel. So where they come from, they're not from the real world. There is nothing that's directly quoted from an academic journal. LSAC adapts materials from the real world and rewrites them for use on the LSAT reading comp. And so I found one case where they were taking a book review from the New York Times and adapting it for a reading comp passage. And so I could compare them side by side, LSAC's boringification of that topic for the reading comp versus how it actually appeared in the New York Times. Of course, the New York Times articulation of those ideas was far more interesting and engaging than the LSAT ones. And so these are purposely written to be legalistic, to be structured like contracts. Not the most exciting, burying the lead sometimes, not the most engaging, but be aware of what they're doing there. And yes, again, Control F is allowed. LSAC has confirmed this. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.